Hello, thank you all so much for being here. For those of you I haven't met before, my name is Matt Bell. I'm a professor of creative writing here at ASU and also the director of the ASU Worldbuilding Initiative that's putting on this event. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our second distinguished lecture featuring Connor Alexander, the creator of the tabletop role-playing game Coyote Crow, among much else. We're very happy to get to present this event as part of this year's Humanities Week. It's a celebratory time and I'm so glad you're here to celebrate with us. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our partners at ASU, including the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Department of English, and the Virginia G. Piper Center for Creative Writing. Thanks especially to the staff of the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics, where this initiative is housed, including Karina Fitzgerald, who did so much of the work to make this event happen. For those of you who are joining the Worldbuilding Initiative for the first time, let me briefly say that it emerged out of the classes on writing science and fiction and fantasy that I've taught for the past several years, many students of whom are in the audience today, where students not only study sci-fi and fantasy, but also invent worlds of their own. The initiative seeks to take the kind of imaginative, speculative thinking that we've been doing in class, work I often think of through Daniel Heath Justice's suggestion to imagine otherwise, and Ursula K. Le Guin's charge for us to become realists of a larger reality, to engage the wider humanities community at ASU and the general public. Our hope is to keep building and strengthening our growing community of innovative thinkers, artists, and futurists in the years ahead, and I hope that those of you present today will feel invited to continue to join us as we do. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's distinguished lecturer, Connor Alexander. Let me begin with his official bio and a brief... Sorry, Connor, I know you're ready to go. I know, I gotta say nice words about you first, though. A brief introduction to Coyote Crow, and then I'll get out of Connor's way. Connor Alexander is a proud citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. Born in California, he currently lives in Seattle, a nerd since he was old enough to watch classic Star Trek reruns, and a punk since he was able to buy his first pair of Doc Martens. Connor spent years wandering around Turtle Island through a myriad of careers, finally settling into a degree and career in film and television. In 2014, he took his first steps into working in the hobby game industry and hasn't looked back. He's worked for a game store, in-game distribution, and since starting Coyote Crow, has been awarded multiple awards, including the Diana Jones Award for Excellence in Gaming. Coyote Crow is a multiple award-winning and nominated sci-fi and fantasy tabletop role-playing game created and led by an all-native team. In March 2021, Coyote Crow became one of the most successful role-playing games to ever fund on Kickstarter, raising more than $1 million. Coyote Crow Games is a tabletop game publisher dedicated to bringing fantastic games to your table while also raising the voices, ideas, perspectives, and imagination of indigenous creatives throughout the game industry. I'm so thrilled to have Connor here to talk to us about the world of Coyote Crow and also the work and collaboration that went into his design. His lecture will be followed by a discussion and a Q&A. Then starting around 2:30, we'll have a character design workshop in which Connor will lead us in creating our own Coyote Crow characters so we all get to participate in the game. It's going to be smart, it's going to be inspiring, it's going to be a lot of fun. We're glad you're all here to be a part of it. Please join me in welcoming Connor Alexander.
Thank you, Professor Bell. OCO, Connor Alexander Dawa Chichalagi. That's I am Connor Alexander. Hello, I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. Thank you so much for this invite. Usually I get to speak to convention crowds or I'm on a podcast, so this is kind of a unique experience for me. And I want to thank Professor Bell and ASU for inviting me. This was out of the blue and a real treat. And I'd also like to just quickly acknowledge the Odom and Peeposh people who are still stewards on this land, so thanks to them. And let's see if I can get my, already technical difficulties. Let's see if we can get, okay, here we go. And my glasses, that's gonna help. All right. A lot of the first part of my speech covered what Professor Bell already so excellently covered, sort of a brief introduction to myself. But I'd like to get to know all of you a little bit first. So if I could, just by a show of hands in this room, do we have any Indigenous Americans in the room? Just by show of hands? One? Okay, just cool. All right, and I know all of you are in some way involved in world building, so I'm not gonna ask that question. But I would love to know how many of you have played Dungeons and Dragons? Okay, all right. I'm amongst my people now, all right, cool. And then have any of you actually played Coyote Crow? No, okay, that's good to know too. That's good to know too. It's good to know because I think, one of the things he mentioned, Professor Bell mentioned, is that the game raised over $1 million on Kickstarter. And when I set out to do this, it was not to raise $1 million, it was to raise literally the money back that I had already put in. And at this point, 2 years down the line, the game has been in distribution for a while now, I am shocked still at how many people are still learning about the game, still discovering it. For Indigenous Peoples Day the other day, we offered the PDF of the game as a free download. And I was astonished to see that it was downloaded more than 7,000 times. And to me, that just speaks to two things. One, it speaks to sort of a hunger for good representation. And I'm going to throw that honor on myself. I'm going to say I had good representation at this point, but that's primarily because of all the feedback I've gotten, especially from my Native cousins out there. But it also speaks, I think, to the wider audience, the non-Native audience, who, you take a show like Reservation Dogs. I think there are people out there who want authentic representation, and you all are smart enough to know when you see it. You know when you see bad stuff, and you know when you see good stuff, and the good stuff shines through pretty quickly, I think. I'm going to skip talking about what are role-playing games because you all raised your hands so enthusiastically about D&D, so I'm not even going to get into the definition of that. But I do want to give you a quick personal background because I feel like my background gives some context to the game that I designed. Matt mentioned that I grew up on science fiction and fantasy. I'm a child of the 70s, so I was growing up on stuff like classic Star Trek and Mission Impossible and The Twilight Zone. I was reading stuff like Asimov and Bradbury. And for me, the world of science fiction and the world of indigeneity, they didn't mix. They were two completely different worlds, and it was always one or the other. There was no crossover there, at least to my knowledge back when I was a kid. And recently, just before I actually put this presentation together, I went back to it. There's a site called Board Game Geek. It's kind of a database of board games out there. And I went back and did a search for indigenous-themed games. And I found a list that somebody had pre-assembled of about 75 games over the last 40 years that involved some sort of indigenous themes. And looking at the top 25, 13 of them were centered on some sort of European conflict. All were centered in the past. None were created by indigenous designers. And I didn't even get into the artist credits because at that point I knew there wasn't going to be any indigenous artists involved. So that just kind of speaks to the chasm of representation that was present when I sort of came up with this idea back in 2018. And what inspired this moment was I was on a plane coming back from a work trip at the company I worked for called PSI, which is a distribution company. They sort of sit in this weird shadowy tier. They're called a consolidator. So they work with a whole bunch of publishers, and then they work with retailers to get those publishers into game stores. So games like, or stores like Barnes & Noble or Target, you're going to see a lot of my former companies work in those places as they represent smaller publishers. So I was coming back from a work trip, and I saw a video game trailer for a game called Greedfall. I don't know if you guys remember it, but it's very sort of steampunk Victorian era where these folks go to an island and there are a bunch of natives there, mystical, magical natives dealing with monsters. And it was so offensive. I never so much wanted to punch a screen as when I watched that. And I think that was the tipping point because at that point, I'd been in the industry long enough where I'd spoken with designers, with publishers about their representation. But honestly, by the time I was seeing the games, all I could do was say, you might want to run this by a consultant. The game was already going to be produced. If the representation was bad, if the art was bad, if their ideas were off, it was too late. That game was going to market. And I could spend probably a whole lecture talking about the litany of bad representation in the gaming industry. But that video game trailer kind of pushed me over the edge. And at that point, I realized I've got some really good privilege here. First of all, I'm a white passing dude in the game industry, right? Like that's a lot of privilege. I can pay my rent. I'm not a starving artist at this point. I had enough savings that I could throw some money to some artists and some writers out there and maybe start getting some graphics done and start doing some writing on my own in my spare time. So sitting in this spot of privilege, I thought, well, what would I want from a game? And at the start, I really didn't know, and I realized that the problem with all of my ideas that I was coming up with was that I always had to tackle colonialism. There was always a point at which I was going to have to explain what colonialism was. If it was an alternate past, why didn't colonialism happen? If it was an alternate future, why didn't it happen? There was always an explanation. And the one thing I did not want to do was force my Native cousins out there to have to re-engage with any kind of colonial trauma they were already dealing with. Not to mention, I think whether you're Native or not, colonialism and its effects run really deep into our culture. I mean, and I'm going to have an example later, a specific example of how it caught me off guard mid-development, and I was lucky enough to have somebody call me out on it, but it runs deep. So I wanted a game that would address colonialism by not addressing it. And really the only option I had at that point was creating an alternate timeline. So I just went back to pre-Columbian contact and said, nope, it never happened. And I wiped out that timeline entirely by creating a catastrophic climate event that changed the history of the Earth. And scroll forward 700 years later, and we have an indigenous Americas that were never colonized. Now, that's not to say those people didn't struggle. They went through hundreds of years of hardship, forced migrations, food shortages, wars, all these other things that can transform a society. And I think that was important to me because I didn't want this to be a utopia. I don't see utopia as quite frankly, it feeds into a lot of bad tropes about Native Americans. So what I wanted was to present a different set of challenges for these people, a different way for them to rise to the top. So the other goal I had for my game was that I desperately wanted it to sit on the shelf next to D&D. And I don't mean from a sales perspective. That was never a goal. That was never an option. But what I mean when I say that is that I think in the role-playing game space, especially if you're looking at a lot of indie games, a lot of them are just happy to be printed at all. A lot of them are straight from website sales or print on demand or single-sheet RPGs. That's fine and everything, but if I'm taking one swing at bat, if I'm going to make one giant swing and hope for a home run, I want a big hardcover book that's glossy, that can sit next to a Dungeons & Dragons book and go, you know what? My natives can see each other in this book. And so that was my next goal. The other goal that I thought was really important is that the game had to be playable by natives and non-natives. As much as I love my fellow indigenous nerds out there are not enough of us to keep an RPG publishing company going, let alone a single book. I wouldn't have had enough funding to get the book published. The other thing is that when you draw that line between native and non-native, it's fine if you're talking about not native. But the minute you start using the word native as an umbrella, you get into the whole idea of monolithic cultures. And we are not a monolith. And so right away I had to decide, is this going to be a book about an alternate Cherokee future? If it's not, how do I make sure that all of the 550 plus tribes in North America are represented, let alone Mesoamerica and South America? That's a big ask, right? So really quickly, I decided that this game had to be playable by both natives and non-natives, and it had to have big enough parameters, a big enough sandbox feel to it that hopefully, if the game did take off, I could have natives come to me who didn't work on it and say, you know, I'm Shoshone. What happened to the Shoshone people in your alternate timeline? And my answer can always be, I don't know, why don't you tell me? You go back and write their history. You're far more qualified to tell me what happened to the Shoshone people than I am. And hopefully that's bringing people to the table rather than me just dictating this alternate timeline right out of the gate, right? So, the sort of MacGuffin that I ended up having to use for it, this meteor, was both a blessing and a curse, right? Because I think a lot of people, a lot of non-natives immediately assumed that this was some sort of attack on non-natives, and it was not. I simply wanted the meteor to be this MacGuffin mechanic that I could use to say, hey, here's where the timeline differentiated. And it was also my chance, though, to bring the fantasy element into the science fantasy of Coyote Crow, because with that meteor, I got to introduce the Adenati. And I'll get into a little bit more on the Adenati later, but this is sort of my fantasy MacGuffin element. And because for me, I also wanted non-natives to have a way to engage with a what-if kind of question, rather than trying to simply tackle the, well, how is my native character going to behave in this world? I wanted them to have something else to glom onto, to grok, that they could use in a fantasy way that made them feel like epic heroes, that didn't feel like appropriation. They weren't going after a specific ritual or a specific piece of real native history. So, you end up going through this 700 years of alternate history. And as we got portrayed here, there's a lot of hard times for folks as they're trying to deal with the struggles. And eventually they come out the other side. And this was one of my earliest pieces of art we did, and I thought it was really important for me to establish with my other writers and artists what I was going for in tone in this world. And you would be shocked at how many people did not recognize what this was when I showed it to them. Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty obvious now, isn't it? But yeah, so these fictional nations up here, I want to point out, it's really important for me to point out that these fictional nations are not like nations that we think of today. These nations were born out of necessity, and while I would consider them things like the Kituagi Federation, they're a collection of nations that have a united purpose. Much of these nations at the start of this game, when the characters come into the game, these are all very tenuous borders. These are all very tenuous arrangements, both externally in their relations with their neighbors, but also internally. It's not in our collective indigenous natures to form these kinds of nations. So right away, that was one of my first points of conflict that I wanted to make. I thought, well, if these people have struggled so long, there had to be a point where they cooperated with each other. But you get far enough down the line, and some of those old grudges, those old problems start to come back when scarcity is not a problem anymore. The next thing I wanted to do was make it a little easier on players, because this is a lot of land to draw maps for. It's a lot of cities to be covered, a lot of cultures to be covered, fictional or not, right? So we decided to dial in on Cahokia. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, by a show of hands, do any know about Cahokia or been to Cahokia? Yeah? Almost none of you. Okay, so amazing. If you ever get the chance, it's right outside of St. Louis. It is a UNESCO heritage site. It is a real city that had up to about 40,000 people. It ended somewhere in the late 1300s. It died out. Well, it was abandoned. It's part of Mississippian culture, and it has some of the largest earthen pyramids in North America. They're hundreds of feet high, and it's a park there, and you can go there and walk those pyramids. And it's right outside St. Louis. And it's situated at a hub of rivers along the Mississippi and Ohio. And I thought, this is a perfect representation, not only for what I want to build in an alternate future, but for how people in our world playing this game can relate to it. This is a real location. You can go back and see the work that was done. And for me, Cahokia, that's also the reason we didn't change the name, by the way. Cahokia is a word that came along. It was not used, it's not an endonym, it's an exonym. So it was a made-up name that the English, we're not even sure exactly where it came from. I'm sure the English or the French bastardized it from somebody's native language. But in the end, we decided to keep that name because we wanted people to have a reminder that this game, this fictional world, is an overlay of our real world, and that a lot of the places you can set your games in are real places. I mean, you can go have an adventure in the Grand Canyon in this world if you want to, or Yellowstone or Yosemite or any of the real world places that are amazing and incredible. I think people often underestimate how many natural beauties there are in this world, on this continent, to explore. So we left Cahokia as it was. So this is a fictional map of Cahokia. We also recentered this one so that north is to the right. And again, that was just once again, we wanted to screw with people's perspectives. That was just to get people questioning their assumptions about the world. But we took some aerial photographs of the original Cahokia and that region and basically just started to fictionalize a map from there. The city doesn't have a lot of roadways. You can't really see it at this scale, but a lot of the technology in this future relies on either hovercraft that go above the house line or magnetic trains that are underground. Or solar-powered aircraft, light aircraft, single individual aircraft that are above the city. So there's almost no roadways. Everything is walkways in the city. If you want mass transportation, you just go down to one of the subterranean levels and catch a train. So one of the things that was really important to me, there were sort of three pillars of world building foundation for me. Those three pillars are static no matter what world I'm working on. The first is language, the second is food, and the third is arts. And I don't think you can build a successful world without those three things connecting in some way, right? Like you're always going to come back to those three, and I feel like the stronger you make those three things, the more the rest of your world building can flow from that. For our language, we decided really quickly that we didn't want to write the game in an actual indigenous language, but we wanted natives to see themselves in the game. So I got together with a conlanger who wrote for the book, Travis Roberts, and he helped construct our language, which is called Chahi. It is a mixture, a Creole, of about 4 or 5 different indigenous languages native to the Great Lakes area. And then we started throwing in random words here and there from all of our other writers. We have Coyote Old Bear, who's Numunu. She threw in some of her words. There's some Cherokee words in there, as I mentioned. There's some Samish words in there. So we tried to just sort of mix it up, and the idea that, a trade language coming out of a trade city makes a lot of sense. Cahokia being this massive hub of culture where dozens of people live. And it was important. But the other thing was accessibility, and I had such an easy route out on accessibility because we had the plain sign language, which still exists today, and we thought, wow, what better way for dozens of tribes who are trying to interact on a trade level, what's easier than them using sign language that's so much easier to teach than a whole other language, right? So when we got to the stage of building Chahi, it was easy for me to just say, well, you know what? Why wouldn't every kid growing up in Cahokia also speak plain sign language? So every character in the game automatically starts speaking Chahi, plain sign language, and then whatever other native language they come from. This also makes for some fun events when you're game playing because it means your characters can speak long distances without making noises, so they can signal each other from across the way, and you can get some fun role-playing moments out of that. I'm really hoping, though, that one day we can get Coyote and Crow translated into other indigenous languages. That is a huge undertaking, partially because native speakers are tough to come by right now, but also just transcribing a book even into, right now I'm working on a Portuguese translation for Brazil, and that has been a 2-year process. So, and that's Portuguese, right? So getting it into a native language is going to be a long haul, but we'll get there one day. The next thing is food, and food for me, I didn't grow up on a reservation, and I grew up being a massive omnivore, and I am one of these people that will literally devour culture through food. I will go to another country or another place and literally eat everything I can find. So when it came to developing the food for this, I reached out to Chef Nico Williams, who's a Cherokee food sovereignty specialist. If you ever get the chance, she's got a place called Burning Cedar Foods that she just opened up in Oklahoma. And if you're not familiar with food sovereignty, it's the idea of connecting your history with food and making sure that the history of your people's food is kept intact. So there's a lot of heirloom seeding going on, a lot of recreations of older recipes going on. So she put together this whole idea of a fictional ecosystem for the food there, based on the 3 sisters, which if you're not familiar is beans, corns, and squash. They work really well together. The one feeds the other nitrogen. They help protect from insects. It's a fantastic setup. And then the idea of things like organized hunting ranges. So rather than factory-produced meat, there's a situation where there are open, protected ranges for hunting and hunting seasons and rangers who protect it. So if you want meat, you go out and hunt it. That's fine. But the other thing that's a little more subtle that I really appreciate that Nico brought to it is something that I had not considered. And that is that in this world, chefs are healers. There is no direct, distinct line between the idea of somebody who does medicine work and somebody who cooks you food. And man, when she told me that over the phone, it hit me hard. I sat with that for a long time. The idea that food itself is medicine. And it's one of the things that I hope people role play out in the book. It's in there, it's literally written in there. But I love the idea that through food we heal. The restaurants, even in this game, are very different. You don't just walk in and sit down and order a plate of food. Instead, the chef and the chef's family live, and you're going to their home, and you're eating in a communal space. You all sit at a round table, and the chef serves you what the chef serves you. And there's nothing, you're not picking anything off of a menu. But I love that idea of breaking bread with someone who has invited you into their home. So that was a big part of our food work in the book as well. And then there's the arts, and we got really deep in the arts on this game, and we went on for a long time. But everything from music, and if you're not familiar with the band Hallucination, they used to go by a tribe called Red. I would highly recommend checking them out. They're an amazing pair of artists. They're indigenous, and they work with incorporating traditional tribal instruments like drums and rattles with modern electronic music. And if you ever see the original Kickstarter video for Coyote Crow, it's their music in that trailer. It's got a fantastic beat, but I thought, man, for an alternate future, what better music could I ask for than something that's got a pounding drum on it and great chants, and then this awesome electronic beat over the top. But it went from everything from music to crafts to architecture to the sports. We had a great time going back in and pulling out traditional sports and thinking about how could we modernize those sports and how would they be affected by this Adenati, which I'm going to get to in a minute because we're going to get to the fantasy stuff here. But even down into board games. We talked about board games. I don't think natives are particularly known for board games, but man, we love games, especially ones where we can rub it in each other's faces. We love competition. We love it. And then the other thing is comedy. And I know we have the bad stereotype of being these stoic individuals, but man, there is nothing like, and I think we can point this to a lot of marginalized communities, there's nothing like hardships to make people funny. You have to find a way to laugh at a certain point. And with comedy, we decided to integrate that with the idea of healing so that the best comedians in all of the country work in hospitals. And that's like the highest level of comedy right there, is when you're there making the sick laugh. So that's a very brief overview. I'm trying to keep it short. Man, I could go for a long time on this stuff. I feel really passionate about it still, all these years later. So, but I wanted to get into the fantasy aspect of it, and this is going back to the Adenati, the MacGuffin element that I added to this. So in this world, a few hundred years after the climate event, people begin noticing a purple stain on all living life, all life, plants, animals, people. They sort of treat it as an omen. It's sort of considered in general a good omen, that the Creator's not abandoned them during these tough times, that they're going to get by together somehow. But as science advances over hundreds of years, they begin to learn that if they take the essence, this Adenati essence, out of an animal, let's say we use a bear, for example, they remove some of the Adenati from a bear and introduce it to a person at the height of their adolescence, that person gets a special bond with that animal. And in the game terms, it plays out as a few stat bonuses. But every few people, every once in a while, about 1 in 20 people, get a special ability. And that special ability, you might call it a superhuman power. It's nothing like flying around and shooting lasers out of your eyes. Nobody in this world is a superhero. But like going back to the example of the bear, there's an ability called Power of the Bear, which would give your character a very brief increase in strength. But one of the things that I like to examine in this is how those kind of abilities would affect society. There is an ability in the game called Coyote's Gaze. And Coyote's Gaze, we put a warning on it because it's, in essence, if you're familiar with D&D, it's the equivalent of a charmed person spell, right? It's almost, by definition, a violation of consent. And so how do you approach that in a game? And rather than just dropping the power into the book, I thought it was really important to say, look, if you use this power, everyone around you is never going to be able to trust you again, right? Your friends, your family, everybody you work with, no one's going to trust that they are not manipulating you. So, not to mention, like, how could you ever run for office? And once people know you have that power, forget it, it's over. So, yes, you can use that power in that game, and we say, hey, maybe examine whether or not you want to include this power in the game. But if you do, it comes with warning labels. And going back to Power of the Bear, I think it's really easy to see how something like that could affect sports, right? So all of a sudden, these sports, some stuff like Chunky or Llama, that are pretty violent games on their own, you start talking about people with superhuman attributes. How quickly does it jump from dangerous to regularly lethal, right? So hopefully I've put enough context in the game that people can pick up on that, and those can be ways to tell stories, right? Those can be great story hooks. On to myths and legends. So this is where, we built out the city, we've talked about a little bit about this alternate future, and then we get into myths and legend. And I decided really early on that I wanted to be very, very careful about when and where we pulled from real legends. There's a lot of ones people know. There's creatures that are cannibalistic. There are there's ones that have made it into the modern American media. And there are reasons I haven't converted many of those directly. There's one in the book that a lot of people know, especially if you've seen Reservation Dogs, named Deer Woman. Deer Woman comes from a number of different cultures. There are variations of her. And we would very respectfully put Deer Woman into the book. But there are lots of others that we didn't. And some that we warped into our own versions. And in this example, this is Ninian in the book, and Ninian is a stone man with a cane who is nearly indestructible and feeds on human beings. And in the original telling of this story, he is impervious to damage, and he was eventually only destroyed through menstrual blood. And when you get into the details of that story, there's a lot of obvious layers, and then there's obviously some more subtle layers to that story. But I wanted to modernize that character because I think in the essence of the book, in the essence of what I wanted to tell, is there were some important lessons there about how do we create characters, or how do we create monsters that still touch on relevant social issues in our real world, right? Like I'm not a person who feels like we have to dodge that. Don't get me wrong, I like going out and having a good combat session or a good adventure as much as the next person, and I grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons. But I also don't think you need to spoon feed everyone all of their social messages. I think there's ways to just put them into your game subtly, and if people play them the way they should be playing them, they'll get the message just fine. You all are pretty smart. So this example, this is Malo. Malo was a character who is based out of a number of different legends from quite a few different tribes who have a legend about something that lives in lakes or still bodies of water. And this is my version. He is a being that is extremely bitter and jealous about the fact that he doesn't like humans going across the surface of the water on boats. So if anybody comes over the edge of the boat, he'll grab them by the ankle and pull them down and drown them. And this specific version came from a really very real scenario where I nearly drowned in seagrass about 10 years ago. So yeah, he was inspired by that. So as you can see, we took a lot of ideas around real native mythology and then just sort of tweaked them around so that they were more appropriate. So in Coyote Crow, we have like sort of the equivalent of what you might call character classes in D&D, but they're very loose. We have warriors, scouts, tinkers, seekers, healers, and whisperers. And it's almost unimportant at that point what you choose. It's more about giving you a sense of comfort and a way to frame your character as you're building them. Because frankly, for me, the important parts of character building are about the character's personality, their gifts and burdens. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the character building portion during the workshop, because I don't want to go on too long about this. But for me, it's important to talk about the fact that the subjective elements of a character in my game are far more important than the number stats. I want to know about their personality and their backgrounds and the things that drive them, not whether or not they have a 3 or a 4 in wisdom. Like, that's just not as important to me. And then, so what sort of stories can you play in Coyote and Crow? That's, I think, been one of my biggest questions. And while we put a section into the book, they somehow keep missing it. So I built it because I wanted to, I built it out in a way that you can tell almost any story in Coyote and Crow. If you're staying in Cahokia, you can tell stories of espionage and inner city intrigue and corruption and murder. You could make a noir, like a cyber noir story. If you want to go for like Monster of the Week, you can go for like an X-Files vibe where your group goes out and finds some sort of mysterious thing and they have to discover what it is, whether or not it's malevolent or benign. You can go for more of like a Heroes for Hire kind of route where, my sister's missing, can you help me find her? And then you have to travel into, out of Cahokia and go to some other place and find her and find out what happened to her. Or you can go more of the traditional Dungeons and Dragons exploration route. If we look back at that map, you might notice that there's a massive ice shelf on what's in our world, Canada, and I got a lot of crap for that from my Canadian friends. Like, why'd you have to make Canada like that? But we really did. We took it from some projections of ice retreat during the last ice age, and where the ice shelf was. That's where we got that. We did not mean to slam Canada. It was not a dig on Canada. But as the Earth is healing and that shelf is retreating, it opens up massive opportunities for exploration. So your characters can go up and see what's up there. Maybe people survive. Maybe people found a way to survive in those harsh conditions. Who knows? Or maybe you want to cross the seas and see what's on other continents. That's all up to you. But I left it pretty wide open. There's a lot you can do in the game. So this kind of brings me toward the end. And what I wanted to say is, whatever you're working on in your own current world building, whether it's D&D or novels, whatever you're working on, please give a moment to think about colonialism. I'm not asking everybody to go back and strip their colonialism out of their games entirely. That was a monumental task for me, and I'm sure I didn't even get it all done. After all, my game's in English, right? So, but I did want to come back to I said I had an example earlier of how colonialism snuck into my game. We were playing an early testing run of the game, and it was an all-native crew. It was my first all-native crew, because at that point I had mixed. So we were playing the game, and there's a scene where the characters come into a room it's in disarray, and it looks like it's been ransacked, and there's a cup tipped over, and one of the players asked, "Oh, what was in the cup?" And I hadn't thought about it, and I just said, "Oh, some coffee." Yeah, I was that guy. So thankfully, one of my writers pinged me privately and went, "Psst, coffee's not indigenous to the Americas." And I went, what? Like, I did a complete double. It was like a Scooby-Doo double take. I was like, what is going on here? And that was a point at which I realized, man, I've got to go back and reread every single thing I've written and examine all of my assumptions and then pass them to another reader and then pass them to another reader, because it's really hard to catch them all. So yeah, so that's what I want to leave you with. Please just think about colonialism and how it affects the world around your characters. Thank you.
Logistics are always the hard part of any public event. Thank you so much for that. That was really fantastic. It's a real pleasure to get to hear some of those stories behind the game and to see how it's all coming together. I think a lot, for those of you who are in the world building class with me, we've talked about so many of these things in our own worlds. It's kind of fun to sort of see how it comes together in a finished product. This is a chance for you all to ask questions. If you have questions here, for those of you who are on Zoom, Liza is manning the chat. If you ask questions there, she'll pass some of them along as well. Maybe just while people are thinking of their first questions, I'll just ask you sort of one of my big picture questions I always ask people at these world building events. And that's partly what are the metrics that you judge maybe other imagined futures by, or other kinds of invented worlds? I think for myself, I often, I've come to sort of judge them by who appears there, who's included, who's thriving, what that thriving costs other people. This sort of, my way of thinking about the hopefulness of any particular imagined future is sort of, that community aspect to it. But I'd be curious what your sort of lens at looking at sort of other futures you see in sci-fi fantasy is.
Smells.
Smells, yeah.
If an author describes smells, I'm in. I don't know why that is, but there's something grounding to me about smells. I'm thinking, for some reason, I'm thinking back to George R.R. Martin, not as an example of smells, but as an example of where he can spend 3 or 4 pages talking about what somebody is wearing or what they're eating, and yet I never got a sense of smell from his work. I don't know why that is. I'm not trying to criticize George R.R. Martin at all, but for me, there's something. It's actually in the Expanse books really well. I think the Expanse, I can smell what a belter smells like, right? And I think that's one of the things that I don't think enough authors address. I also really like it when your backstories include family, and not just who the family is, but why the family is. Family dynamic makeups are really important, I think, to character motivations. And if you can build out why a family is in dysfunction or why it works together and what those external factors are, then I feel more drawn into that world.
Yeah, I love that. Questions from you all. Does anybody have something they'd like to ask Connor? Karina has a microphone and we'll bring it around to you. Oh, this is such a talkative bunch, so we're pretending they don't have questions. Kruger, come right up here in the front. Karina, will you want to? Thank you for starting us off. The hardest question to ask is the first one and the last one, you know? Yeah.
I guess I just want to ask, when it came to creating the alternate timeline, you know, like, did you have any other ideas for how you would go about it? Or, you know, from the start, was it always going to be, you know, like at the beginning of 1400, you know, the meteor that causes the climate? You know, did you have any other pitches?
So right out of the gate, I'll have to say a lot of what I wanted to do was inspired by Rebecca Rowanhorse's Trail of Lightning. And if you haven't read that, it's sort of a post-apocalyptic vision of the future where there's been a great flood and the Dene people have been spared. And so it's sort of like a walled city now. And there was a lot of that originally, like a post-apocalyptic, because I thought, well, that's how you reset worlds, right? Like if I want to reset the Earth, I'll just cause an apocalypse. But I'm left with that problem again of colonization and the after effects, because everything in that world of Rebecca Rowanhorse's still is, I mean, they're driving trucks, they have guns, they have all the other trappings of colonialism still stuck on there. And I'd seen enough of that, and I didn't want to ride Rebecca's coattails, right? I didn't want to just create Trail of Lightning, the role-playing game. Yeah. So I kind of had to back up. Yeah.
Val, please.
That's loud. Something that I think about a lot in world building, whether it's worlds that I'm making or worlds that other people have made that I'm looking into, is I'm always really fascinated by what the children are doing in that world, whether that's like the games that they play with each other or like what school looks like for them. So if you could talk a little bit about that and like maybe like what education looks like in their world, or like what sort of games kids play, or what growing up is like.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So early on, we started talking about hypothetical educational systems because there isn't a lot of record for pre-Columbian education with indigenous people in any culture that I'm aware of. We kind of had to sort of extrapolate from external sources, or external forces, excuse me, how would that be shaped? Specifically because I wanted the end result to be a universal free education at all levels for everybody in Cahokia. Specifically in Cahokia, I wanted anybody to be able to learn anything at any time. What we ended up with was a system where for half of Cahokia's history, you ended up with simply families teaching children in family, and it was very sort of a internal matter. But as the city began to grow, they began to realize that there were just too many specializations, there were too many smaller functions that weren't being passed along properly. And we haven't fleshed that out fully, but I have in my head, I have this character, and she's a complete troublemaker who decided that she wanted to start teaching stuff outside of her family to whoever wanted to hear it, and that got her in trouble because some of it was sacred knowledge. And she said, no, we need to start passing this along in a better way. She's sort of the impetus for their schools, but now instead of people whose job it is to be a professor, no offense.
I'm always looking for a way out. It's good.
So in Cahokia, instead, what people do is, whatever their career is, they take a year or two out of their career and they go back and teach. And then they go back to their career. And so there's this continual rotation. And people are welcome to jump from, there's not really majors in essence. Basically, you can go, oh, I want to start learning about this, and this person is coming in to teach for 2 years. I'm going to go study under them, almost like an understudy program. As far as games go, we really kind of, I want to give credit to a gentleman named Matt Fantastic. He's not native, he's a game designer. He's one of the biggest weirdos in the world. And I love the man to death. He did a board game called Before There Were Stars. It's probably a little hard to find, but I asked permission from him and the publisher, Smirk and Dagger Games, to use the description of the game in my game as a game that they play. What the game is it's just a handful of dice, 6-sided dice, and you roll them, and then you choose to organize them physically into a constellation of stars, each pip on the dice being stars, and then you tell a story about creation, and you tell your own creation myth, and everybody else adds to that creation story, and then you tell a development, you roll again, and you tell a development portion based on that constellation, and then you tell the end of that civilization through the final round. And I thought, man, that is such a native idea. Like I actually said that to Matt. I was like, man, that's such an Indian thing to do, man. But those are the kinds of games that I want to see in that world, games that inspire imaginations. There's not alcohol in my world, right? So there's not bars, there's no alcohol. I mean, within Mesoamerica, there was traditionally some alcohol use, but it was very much for ceremonial purposes. So instead of bars or traditional nightlife like we have here, there are things like game cafes and tea lodges, and people play games for hours and hours. There's like all-night game lodges. So people grow up playing them.
Love that. Other questions?
Hi.
Yeah, please.
Boy, I was kind of surprised. So for me and my world building, I think one of the most important things in my eyes is the myths and the legends behind everything, because it is like a driving force for a lot of things. And as someone who's also like trying to get in touch with my own culture, I was just wondering, and implementing it in my own stories. I was wondering where do you draw the line for including certain things? How do you take inspiration? What are some of like the guidelines and ideas that you take so you don't like approach it?
That is a complex one.
Yeah.
Wow. I think well, I'll give you the short answer, then I'll give you the long answer. The short answer is a lot of peer review. And when I say peer review, I mean the people who would be affected by that story getting out in the wrong way. So for me, it was speaking with my cousins, speaking with my other Cherokee writers. But I think there's also, I think going back to that Malo example of the being that lives in the water, if you're from a tribe in that area that has those myths and legends, you're going to recognize that. You won't recognize the name or the drawing or anything like that, but you're going to get the overall idea. I think there's a very big gray area that frankly was one of the most uncomfortable for me to navigate in building this book, because I'm trying to build something that Native people are going to love. And I would say 99% of them like it when they hear about it, but there's the 1% that still think I crossed lines, right? Yeah. And at a certain point, I just had to realize, you know what? I did my due diligence. I checked with my peers. I checked with my heart. I feel like this story is okay to tell. You're still going to piss someone off. I'm sorry.
I think an interesting thing there's a errata page you can download that just like where you guys have like adjusted some terminology or made some different changes because in reflection efforts on the world, to still be listening, right?
Yep, absolutely. And there's a lot I would change on a second edition of the book. I mean, not drastic amounts, but I think that's true of anybody, right? Everybody wants to go back and change something, no matter what.
Hey, what's up? Hey. So I just, when I build a world, I'm always sort of trying to keep class distinctions in my mind, because that's a big factor I see driving people's lives a lot.
Oh, so we're talking class in our world, not class like D&D class, right?
No.
Sorry, okay.
Yeah, like economic, social class, right?
Yes, thank you. Gotcha.
If there are any, what are the class distinctions in your world?
So there are class distinctions, and I think that's going back to where I got called out by some people for being a utopia, and I disagree with them strongly on that one. Oh man, I forgot to get to this in the presentation. Damn it. All right.
You'll have to come back again.
So I'm about to get on a soapbox here, all right? Education, housing, food, shelter, that is not a utopia. That is the bare minimum for civilization. And the fact that I've been accused of having Cahokia be a utopia because people have those things says far more about this world than it does about mine. And so there are class distinctions, and for me they're a source of drama, but they're also a source, a reflection, I think, of a lot of Native politics. And I'm not going to get too much into the Native politics right now, but I will say that if you have everybody with their minimum needs met, and that they're the lower class, the people who are just living with the bare needs, right? They've got health, they've got healthcare, they've got food, they've got education, but then you still have a strata of the rich, and it doesn't really matter the proportion, it matters the spread, right? So you still got people way up at the top. And in my case, it's the Council of 12 that run the city of Cahokia. And this Council of 12 They are lifetime appointments, and they are generally passed from family member to family member for generations. There is no way to check that kind of power. Those people have complete control. And while everybody living under them might think, oh, this is a great life, I've got no complaints, it doesn't mean that those people are not corrupt and are not, not completely manipulating the system to their advantage. And I think a lot of people miss that if they're skimming. Same goes for the police force within Cahokia. The de facto sort of starting point for a lot of characters is called the Suyata, who are it's a gimmick to get characters quickly engaged in adventure, because if they're all members of the Suyata, then somebody could say, hey, you need to go on this mission, right? But the Suyata are a completely untethered police force with absolute authority. Nothing could go wrong with that, right? Nothing. So hopefully players take that and run with it, because I want to be able to bring in real world issues and struggles and deal with them in this game.
Please. Green up for a minute. And we'll go back to Joseph.
Hello. Oh, so for me, whenever I start making a world, actually one of the first things that inspired me to write one of my novels was seeing this, like, beautiful drawing, and I was like, I want to write in that space. So when you came up with this idea, how did you create like the visual aesthetic? Like, where did you, like, I know that you probably had teams, artists, but like, how did you work with them to create like an aesthetic and like visual to this world?
That's another great question, and frankly, it was one of my biggest struggles. So as a person who's written quite a bit, but has never been in the role of art director, I feel like I'm a decent communicator, but communicating to indigenous artists, so first of all, if you're talking about indigenous artists who are working in traditional mediums, they're working on their specific culture's history, they're working with specific color palettes and formats, right? And then if you've got folks who are more like pop culture artists, whether they're working in graphic novels or board games or whatever it is, they've got their own aesthetic. But trying to get a group of artists, any group, any size, of native artists to see a future that is decolonized is a mountain to climb. And I mean, it was quite frankly one of the most frustrating experiences of my life. Not because they didn't want to, they wanted to get to where I wanted them to be. It was just tough to communicate my vision. And I would, so often I would come back with things like, no, there's no need to put chrome on everything. This is sort of a cyberpunk analogy, right? But this world wouldn't be covered in chrome, right? This is not Mad Max, right? So that struggle is still very real for me with all of the artists I work with. There were a couple of pieces I found. Virgil Ortiz, I don't know if you guys know Virgil Ortiz, but he's a New Mexican artist who works in indigenous futurisms. So he puts an indigenous spin on a lot of his work. And there was a specific piece that he came out with, a woman who was wearing like a chrome-plated helmet with a visor over it, and then metal feathers going over the top. And I said, this is what I want without the chrome. Like, let's start there and work our way up, right? But even just like re-envisioning Cahokia, taking those bare bones of what Cahokia really is, we started with photos and drawings from what it might have looked like at the peak of its civilization, and said, how do we strip all this now out and put in eco-friendly things that don't look like they're coming out of a Blade Runner movie, right? Like, we don't want skyscrapers. That's not, I could get into a whole thing about skyscrapers, and yeesh, there's a deep developmental rabbit hole there. But yeah, it was very tough. It was very tough to get artists to see my vision. And I think the one that spoke to me, the artist that spoke to me first was Kyle Charles, I'll just say, I also want to mention this artist here, Sat Decarones Esquivel. This is the story guide screen, our DM screen for the game. And he is an artist now who I have completely keyed in on. He gets what I want, that mix of fantasy and science fiction in a way that we've dropped the colonial trappings. So I don't know if I answered that, but I hope so. A little bit? Okay.
I saw, Joseph, do you have your hand up in the back before? Am I making that up? Maybe not. What? Okay, yes, yeah, please. Oh, Hayden, thank you.
Is this working? Oh, wow, okay.
It's weird hearing your voice amplified, isn't it?
I feel like this is kind of the wrong question to ask, so I'm sorry if it is, but I always see maps that are just like one continent. I get so curious about what's happening in the rest of the world and how it's changed. Is there...
Yeah, that was very intentional. It wasn't so much a slight, but I will say it was intentional. I just didn't want to address what happened in the rest of the world. I didn't want to make the conversation about that. And I think it's telling that one of my biggest pieces of blowback I've actually had from folks who don't like the game is that people assume that, like, I've killed everyone, like everyone else is dead, and I'm like, I never said that, or that like a lot of people assume that, like, the meteor came down and crashed into Europe, and I'm like, I never said that. I never said that, not once. But people just assume, right? Because they assume that if they didn't die, then why haven't they colonized America? And my question to them back is always, I don't know. Why not? You tell me. It's not my job to make up the alternate histories for everybody on Earth, right? So, like, that to me, that goes back to the sort of sandbox philosophy that I wanted to create, which was I wanted to leave enough room for individual storytellers to come up with their own ideas about what happened. I've had players come back and tell me, they're like, oh, well, we just decided that Europe was developing slowly too, that they went through the whole cataclysm, and now they're invading, and we're making our campaign about these modern natives fighting off colonial invaders. I'm like, cool, you do you. Like, that's not what I would do, but you do you. Cool, awesome.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then we'll move into the next part.
Intimidating watching everyone look at me. But so yesterday night, I saw a post from Kelly Bender. He's a narrative designer. He posted how a lot of his work and research is mostly research instead of writing, as well as going through various different people, as well as different people if he's working with different cultures. So we had a little back and forth about that. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, despite having good research and talking to people of different cultures when trying to integrate their cultures into your work, how are you able to possibly do that when you still have a Western lens? Because I come from a very Western standpoint. I'm trying to understand not only my own culture, but also the culture of different Africans, as well as different Asian people, as well as indigenous people. I'm trying to understand that and incorporate that into my work. I'm trying to figure out how best to do that within a Western lens. So I guess my question is, how do you do that? How do you move out of the Western lens in order to make it?
I'll let you know when I've got there, man. I'm still working on that. No, but it's a good question, and it's one that's really hard to answer. I wrote I would say about 2/3 of the book before I brought on anybody else, because I felt like I wanted my vision to be clear to them so that they could read what I was doing and get it, so that I didn't have to just keep having conversations over and over again. I wanted them to have some work to start from. But I knew from the beginning that I could not be the lone voice on this. Unlike a novel, it needed multiple perspectives, right? So we ended up with 6 writers overall from all over North America, and then more than 24 native artists working on it. So I knew it had to be collaborative if it was gonna not just feel authentic, but feel lived in. It needed to feel like a lived-in world. And for your situation, man, life as a native who did not grow up on a reservation, I'm going to spend my whole life reconnecting. I spoke some words in Cherokee at the beginning. I am not a native Cherokee speaker. I'm still trying to learn my language. I'm still learning, my grandmother's recipes. It's a lifetime of work on that one. So good luck, man. I feel you.
Thank you so much. I think we're gonna stop here at the Q&A. Give me 1 second, then we'll clap for Connor. Just to give you what's gonna happen, we're gonna take just a quick break, let everybody reset. We're gonna pass out some materials for the character creation workshop. You can get more food and drinks for those of you who are here in person. For those of you at home, just do it in your house. I know not everyone can stay for the second half, so if you do have to leave, please feel free. But let's join me in thanking Connor, and then we'll take a 5-minute break and we'll restart. Thank you so much, Connor.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you. Okay, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started with the character creation workshop here in just a second. We only have 45 minutes for this, so traditionally I like to have like maybe even a little bit more than an hour sometimes, especially because there tends to be a lot of questions. But we'll go through these. You should hopefully have access to 3 sheets here. One is your Coyote and Crow character sheet. The next one is the one that says character creation at the top. And that's going to be sort of your first page. Then we'll go to the page that's on the back of that where it starts with gifts and burdens. And then we'll follow up with abilities, the third page that says abilities at the top at the end. This is a very light version of character creation. The version in the book is a little crunchier. There's a little more math involved and a point spending, that sort of thing. We're going to skip some of that today, but we are going to hopefully get you to a point where when you leave here, you'll have a character that would be playable. So don't worry too much about if I go a little fast or something. Don't worry about it. You can always fill this in later. Most importantly, I just kind of want to give everybody the flavor for what a character feels like in this game and sort of what my thought process was for these character sheets, because honestly, nothing on this character sheet is by accident. We worked on this for a long time, not just from a structural and game mechanic point of view, but for in a way that was trying to convey what was important to us for these characters. So, starting at the top of your character sheet, you'll notice that that entire box that's shaded blue is all subjective information. And we put that at the top because really, to me again, the most important information about a character in a game is the subjective stuff. Stats are easy, whatever, but which is why all that stuff is at the bottom. But looking over on the sheet that says character creation, we start off every character with defining what their motivation is. Motivation doesn't necessarily have a game mechanic effect. We have an optional rule for it that slightly affects it. This is sort of my answer to alignment in D&D. So, because I see motivation as far more vague than any kind of absolute moral value system like alignment is supposed to be. Quite honestly, I find alignment kind of ridiculous. Sorry, no judgment. But so go ahead and pick yourself out a motivation, and it does not have to be one of these. You can feel free to modify. I'd like to also say that in general, when you play Coyote and Crow, you should be sitting down with your entire group and building your characters together, far more than any other game I've played. And that's because we encourage people to know each other, their characters to know each other when you start playing. Most of the time, people are either best friends, they're coworkers, they're family, they're romantic partners, whatever it is. There's a connection that starts those characters off together. So when you go through this, we encourage players to share as much information as they can about the characters, the exception being obviously if your character has some sort of deep, dark secret. But I think if everybody knows their motivation going into character building and everybody knows what the other people at the table's motivations are, you can right out of the gate create some really interesting character conflicts. You can choose to create some story tags for your story guide. They're going to help them go, oh, this person is going to conflict with this person, and let's have fun with that. Let's build something on that. So once you've gotten your motivation, motivation will be up the top right corner of your character sheet there. You can also feel free to, I always fill in my name last. That's just a thing for me, I don't know why, but I fill in my name at the end when I've got a vibe for the character. Things like your age, you can put in whatever age you want on your character sheet, that's fine. When we get to archetypes, as I mentioned during the speech, we have 6 in the game, and they're all very loosely defined. And in fact, my favorite part of the archetypes in this game is that we have suggestions underneath in the description of the archetypes for what people's jobs might be, like what they might do in their daily life. And one of my favorites is under healer is death doula. I have a friend who's got a death doula character, and that is a person who simply goes around and helps people deal with the loss of loved ones. And that's a thing in real life. So don't worry too much about your archetypes. In the end, the only thing your archetype is going to decide is it's going to give you a minor stat bonus, a skill bonus, and then help you pick out some of your other things later. But it's really minor. Don't sweat it too much. In fact, I sometimes encourage people to put down an archetype they want to play against. You know, the idea of like maybe they're a warrior, but they don't want to be any warrior anymore. They're older and they're retired and they're trying to find a different path in life. So things like that. Then when you get to other identifiers, age, tribe, gender, sexuality, all of those are completely optional. You never have to put those in my game. Tribe, if you're not native, please leave blank. If you are native, I think we only had one person here who raised their hand earlier, you can put your own tribe if you want to. We may eventually be coming out with fictional tribes that have formed since the AWIS, the climate disaster, but currently we do not. And it's not really important because you can simply be a citizen of that nation. You can be a citizen of the Haudenosaunee Nation or the Dene Republic without having to name an actual tribe. So don't worry about that too much. The next thing we get into is paths, and paths are one of my favorite parts of the game. So you'll see on that character creation sheet, there's a whole bunch of paths. These are the paths that are the most common in Cahokia. They're not all the paths that exist, and in fact, these are all animals that would be common in the Cahokia area. So in general, paths are sort of designed to be based around the geography of the area you're playing. And I'm really looking forward to the day that we get to something like the Tiswak Alliance in the Pacific Northwest, and we can do things like Path of the Orca and Path of the Octopus, things like that. So in the meantime, though, what you're going to do here is pick a path, and it connects to two different things. It connects to two stats. Well, you'll see related stat down next to it. So for example, oh, sorry, one second, I get my glasses on again, Jesus. So down, let's say under paths, if you look at Path of the Coyote, it's got agility and intelligence. That means that when we get to your stats, you would get a +1 agility and a +1 intelligence. The other thing it will dictate, that your path will dictate, is the list of abilities that you can choose from, which are on that second sheet. We'll get to those a little later. But just keep in mind that if you're, maybe if you're a scout, you want to have something that has agility involved. So maybe you're going to pick Path of the Fox. Again, don't feel like you're too locked in or you're having to go too far down the rabbit hole on that one, no pun intended, but like, it's not D&D. So your archetype is not going to dictate your future in this game. So once you've picked a path, and I'll give everybody a minute to look over those paths. Oh, hey, Matt, speaking of things I wanted to change, if you look down on that list, Path of the Salmon. It should have been Path of the Sturgeon, and it made it past all the editors and all the way into the damn game, and I curse it. I curse that. That was supposed to be for the Pacific Northwest expansion, damn it. Just pretend it's sturgeon. Move along. All right, so I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit because we are a little short on time, and I want to make sure everybody has some time to give me some questions and stuff. But the next thing that we have on the back of that first sheet is gifts and burdens. Now, gifts and burdens. Has anybody here played World of Darkness or Vampire the Masquerade, anything like that? Okay, a few of you. All right. So the idea for gifts and burdens, I'm not really sure it translates into Dungeons and Dragons, but it's an idea that you're giving your character external benefits or drawbacks that are going to help or hinder them in ways that don't really fit neatly into a normal D&D mechanic, right? It's not a low stat or a spell or something like that. So we have some examples listed here. You're welcome to work with your story guides to create your own when it comes to real gameplay. But in general, the way it works is, in the full game system, you have a number of points that you're going to be building your character with. Gifts would subtract from points because they're good things for you, so it costs you points, while burdens add some points. And they're on a scale of 1 to 3. So for example, and the one I always like to use is the first one there is listed as family. So imagine you have a sister. Now maybe your sister is just not an important part of your life, or maybe she's an important part of your life, but not so much that you want to affect the game mechanic. Well, then you wouldn't put her down as a gift or a burden. You would just leave it as part of your background. You'd say, I have a sister, and put it in your background, and that's the end of that. But if you believe that your sister is an important enough of a factor in your life that she would affect gameplay, then you can assign a gift or a burden rank to her. Or maybe if you have siblings, she might be a gift and a burden. So the idea being is, maybe she's a gift too because she's an incredible engineer, and every time your vehicle breaks down, she's there to repair it, and you can trust her to go back and repair your vehicle. Or maybe she's a burden too because she's a small child and continually needs to be babysat. And it's just like, oh, she's always following me everywhere. That's up to you to decide. And I always like to emphasize that gifts and burdens are from your character's perspective. It's how your character sees that thing. That's important because when we get into things like quirks, which I intentionally left very vague, there are more sensitive concepts out there that I didn't want to put into the game because a lot of it has to do with how we view these things. So I very intentionally went vague on that one, and that's so that people can just deal with it how they want. They can put in whatever they feel like, whether it's a disability, however they want to view their disability. And we didn't get into it in the presentation, but there's a whole philosophy behind cybernetics in my world that is a very different worldview from cybernetics in our world. But then we have things like notoriety, addictions, all kinds of stuff. Companions are a really fun one because this is where my native cousins get really excited because it means they can have like dogs and snakes and birds and things like that. Or you can have human companions if you want. But again, it's just a rank of 1 to 3, and then you decide, your character decides whether it's a gift or a burden. And for this exercise, maybe pick 1 or 2 and just decide how much it affects your character. And I found in my playtesting that once you have the person's archetype, a couple of gifts and burdens down, and a motivation, you really start to get a sense of who they are. It doesn't even take the stats. It doesn't even take the stats before you really start to get a sense of who this person is and what is driving them and what they're all about. You know, if I say somebody is a warrior with a family burden of 3 and is Path of the Bear, you're going to start to get an idea of who that person is, especially once you start to drop in some of those other modifiers like age. So then we're going to get into stats, and stats in my game are based on a scale of 1 to 5. So for this exercise, we're not going to use the point system to buy your stats. There are 9 stats in the game: strength, agility, endurance, intelligence, perception, wisdom, spirit, charisma, and will. Those are all on a scale of 1 to 5. And for this exercise, I always suggest to folks that they put in 2 4s, 2 3s, and the rest 2s. And then, don't forget to give yourself a +1 bonus for whatever archetype you picked. If you'll look back at that archetype on the first page again, you'll see that, no, I'm sorry, I don't have that listed on here. So the warrior would get +1 in strength, the scout gets +1 on agility, tinker gets +1 on intelligence, the seeker gets +1 on perception, the healer gets +1 on spirit, and the whisperer gets +1 on charisma. But those, again, it's not super important. Again, just 2 4s, 2 3s, and the rest 2s. Whatever you feel like distributing your points out there among your stats. And under derived stats, don't worry about all that. That's a little too involved for this character creation process. Those are numbers that you can all just sort of mathematically figure out when you're actually going to play the game. But and I'll give you a minute to go over those. Does anybody have any questions at this point? I realize I'm kind of going fast. No? Everybody cool? Pretty cool? Okay. Oh, yeah.
What's like a seeker and a whisperer?
Oh, yeah. I suppose I could kind of go over what those are, right? So warrior's pretty obvious. Scout is pretty obvious. You can sort of tell kind of what they do based on by like what their stat is connected to. So tinker is pretty obvious. Seeker, I always give you the examples of either private eyes or philosophers are my 2 examples. People who are looking to greater their knowledge and like to poke into other people's business. And then healer's pretty obvious. Whisperer, if you've ever played D&D, whisperers are your bards. They're your troublemakers, the actors, the shenanigans givers, right? Yeah, did somebody else have a question? Yeah. Yes, and that was, sorry, I was going to come around to that. Yes, so the related stats under paths, you're going to get a bonus on each of those 2 stats as well. And this brings me to a really fun point, which is if you think about it, let's say you picked warrior, and you gave yourself your 4 in the warrior, and then you got the +1 from being a warrior, and now to 5, and then you gave yourself the +1 because you picked a path that is strength related. Now you're at 6, and I said the scale goes to 1 to 5. Well, that means you permanently are above, you have superhuman strength. The problem with that is that anybody who goes above 5 has to take a rank of notoriety burden, because there is no way you can walk around being stronger than Arnold Schwarzenegger without everybody knowing who you are. Being smarter than Einstein or more charismatic than Brad Pitt or whoever the hell, everybody's going to know you immediately. So you get notoriety automatically. So some people choose not to take stats that go above 5 just because it might sound cool, but it's going to put you in a very weird position in life. Thank you. All right. By the way, in developing the paths, we had a lot of fun figuring out which animals we were going to use and then trying to figure out what stats. There was probably a good 2 or 3 hours of arguing amongst 6 natives about what stats would be connected to what animal. That was a fun fight. So then once you have your stats down, and I'm going to go a little slower on this one because you might still be working on your stats, you get into skills. And the way we did skills, and this is, I think, this trips up more people than any other part of the character creation. The example I like to use is ranged weapons. So let's say you've got a character and you want them to be good at using a bow. The way the game works is, if you look under ranged weapons under skills, it says there are 2 related stats, perception and agility. Now, if your character, let's say, has never picked up a bow in their life, and has no ranks in skills of ranged weapons, they could still pick up a bow and fire it, right? Like, they could still try, even if they've never done it before, they have no practice, but they could do it. In my game, if you do that, you're going to use the lower of the 2 stats. So if you looked at ranged weapons and you had a 2 perception and a 3 agility, you'd use the 2 perception. And that would be it. You just rolled 2 dice, 2 for the number of your perception. But let's say you do have some training in archery, and so you've got a ranged weapons of rank of 3. Well, now you get to use the higher of your 2 stats. So instead of using the 2 perception, now you'd use the 3 agility, plus the 3 ranks in skill, which means you're now rolling 6 dice instead of 2. This just shows how far you jump up once you've been trained with a bow and how much more likely you are to hit a target if you've actually had some practice with the weapon. So this goes for pretty much all of the skills in the game. And in theory, these skills that are all listed here cover everything. I won't cover specialized skills today, but there's also specialized skills where, like, let's say, for example, you're decent at using all ranged weapons, but you're really good at using a bow, which means you would have a higher rank specifically using bows. So you can do that as well. And that goes for pretty much all the skills. You know, art is another good example. Maybe you're really into sculpture, so you have 1 rank in art, but you have 5 in sculpture. So for skills, I always recommend that everybody pick out 10 skills at rank 2. Just 10 at 2. Pick out the 10 skills you think your character would have at rank 2. And the way you fill that on your character sheet is, I would write in the rank first, and then look at the where it says stat in the column to the left, and just figure out which stat is the higher of those 2s, of the 2 related stats. I know that probably can be a little confusing. So does anybody have any questions at that point? I'm happy to clarify on that. Wow. College students, y'all are smart.
We'll be able to walk through these stats more in depth.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So you'll notice that the stats are sort of broken out into columns and rows, and that's very specific. The first row there, strength, agility, and endurance, are all physical. The second row is all mental, intelligence, perception, and wisdom. The third row is all spiritual, spirit, charisma, and will. I didn't get a chance to talk about it in the presentation, but to me it was very important that we do not delineate between spirituality and magic in this game. If somebody asks me, is there magic in my game? My answer is always, is there magic in this world? I don't know. That's up to you to decide. I'm not going to answer that for anybody. So I very intentionally broke out the stats into these 3 columns because I feel like all 3 have real value in the RPG. Additionally, the rows also mean something. So strength, intelligence, and spirit are all sort of your force, your power within that sphere. The agility, perception, and charisma are all sort of your finesse within that sphere. And then your endurance, wisdom, and will are all sort of your reserves or your fortitude within that sphere. So they're all sort of interconnected and related to each other there. Hopefully that makes sense. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Cool. So the other thing I wanted to mention about skills, and we don't have to do this in this character workshop, but you'll notice that there are a few skills that have asterisks on them. Ceremony, cybernetics, medicine. And again, in this game, if you have a 0 rank in a skill, you can still do it. Again, like I mentioned earlier, if you have 0 rank in ranged weapons, you can still pick up a bow and fire it. So when you actually finish your character here, you can write in all the zeros and then figure out which is the lower stat. You don't have to do this here today, but you can figure out the lower stat and still get a total dice pool that you would be rolling. The exception to that is the asterisk skills. You cannot do a skill in this game that's asterisk unless you have at least 1 rank in it. You can try to do a ceremony till you're blue in the face, but if no one has ever taught you how to do a ceremony, it's not going to go very well. You don't luck into that. And same with cybernetics, right? Like, yeah, you better have at least 1 rank before you start pulling someone's arm off. Okay. Should I keep moving here, folks? I want to give you a little time. I know you're all right now, and I don't want to rush anyone. Everybody need a couple more minutes? Yays, nays, yes? Any more questions at this point? Hmm? Yeah.
What exactly does skullduggery entail?
So skullduggery in my game is pretty much everything that thieves do. There is a thin line there between, say, being a con artist and being an actor, right? So you can sort of put acting into both those categories, but I always assume skullduggery is more of a goal-oriented version of acting, right? Like you're trying to get something out of somebody. It includes breaking into security systems, which again might cross over into something like hacking, if we're talking about computers. But yeah, it's a wide variety of illicit behavior. Oh, and there was another question, right? You got a question too? Yeah.
Sorry, do you mind re-explaining how we handle skills?
Absolutely. Yep, no problem. It is definitely the more complex part of the game for sure. So you're going to pick out 10 skills that you would think your character would have, and then under each of those 10, just write 2 on the rank, and then figure out which of the 2 related stats it's to. So on the skill chart over here, you're going to have all the skills listed out, and they're going to have related stats. Whichever is the higher of the 2 stats you chose earlier, you'd write that in under the stat, and then just add the 2 numbers together to get your total. That's correct. Yeah, if you're that far ahead of the game, go for it. I didn't want to spend too much time on that because it's, you could do that on your own. But yeah, that way once you're done, you have a pretty good visual representation of what your character is capable of, what the things are that they focus on. In the real game, I've seen a tendency, characters want to min-max their characters. If you guys are familiar with the term min-max for D&D, it's the idea that you want to really pump everything you've got into one thing, that will backfire on you in this game a lot. It's easy to go, oh, I want a warrior with 6 strength and uses a war club, and I'm going to put all of my stat points into war club so that I'm rolling 15 dice every time I swing a war club. Great. How often are you swinging that war club, and what's it going to do against a spirit? There's a lot of intangibles in this world and a lot of situations where just swinging a weapon at something doesn't necessarily get you out of a situation. So be careful with that. Yeah. And I think the other thing to remember too is that, again, this would normally be in an environment where you're working on building a character together. So I've had characters. I had a couple players who built twins, and they intentionally built completely different skill and stat sets so that they would play off of each other, and then they could get into combat and do all these really cool moves by working off of each other. So that's sort of the advantage of being able to play and build your characters in a group setting, which is really nice. And before we get into abilities, which is sort of your superhuman power, the rest of the things in the game really aren't super important for right now. We don't really have there is money in the world. It's called Nizi. Nizi's in the world, but we don't really track it by, I didn't want anybody to have to do accounting work when they played my game. So wealth is abstracted to this idea of wealth rank, and everybody starts with a wealth rank of 4 on a scale of 1 to 8. And if something costs less than a 4, you just can have it. It's like the equivalent of you going to a vending machine. Nobody really cares if you're going to count out your quarters for your character, right? So, and then anything above, you have to potentially take on a burden of debt. So if you want to go above your normal wealth rank 4 to buy a vehicle or something like that, you might have to take on a short-term debt that your character can work off over the course of gameplay. So we won't worry too much about starting equipment. In general, I always tell people, hey, if it's a cool thing your character has at the start of the game, cool, that's it, that's fine, they can have it. Same with background, and again, name we always put on at the end. And then don't worry about derived stats. Derived stats are basically, like if you're familiar with D&D, it's the equivalent of like your armor class, like how tough it is to hit you, and then also like how many hit points you have. That's what derived stats are. And again, we don't have to worry about figuring those out now. But I did want to get into abilities. So hopefully you are all feeling okay with your skills, and we can jump on to abilities here. And if not, we'll catch up later. But so the abilities are based on whichever path you chose at the beginning. So let's say, for example, if you chose Path of the Bison, then you can choose any of the abilities that are listed under either Strength or Will. So for example, looking at the Strength powers, there's Power of the Bear, Skin of the Armadillo, and Warrior's Fire. Or you can choose from the Will selection, which is Wolverine's Resolve, Spirit's Covenant, or Owl's Watch. Now the description of these are pretty brief here. This is what we use on our story guide screen, just as a quick reminder for people who are running the game as to what the abilities are. But in general, I'll say this about all the abilities in the game. They all come with a cost. This is not a situation where you can just use that thing over and over and over again. It usually costs you points of will or mind. In some cases, mind or soul to activate them, and those are basically a limited number of points you get based on your stats. It's one of your derived stats. So you have a sort of a fuel limit on these abilities you can use, and some of them are more extreme than others, depending on the scope of the power. And most of them, I think, are pretty straightforward when you describe them, like Power of the Bear is increased strength, or Warrior's Fire is you upgrade your damage. Think of it sort of like a berserk mode. Or Chameleon's Shine is you're extremely stealthy, you turn sort of semi-invisible. So there's things that are very sort of obvious. But then there's others that I think, and this is where you get into some fun where role players are less concerned with combat and more concerned with storytelling, and I intentionally wanted to leave some abilities in there that spoke to those players. So if you look at one like under Wisdom, it says Read the Earth. gain insights with wisdom and an endurance check. So in that one, you basically go into like a meditative state, and the story guide will give you information. And what that information is, they decide. But whatever it is, it's insightful. It's going to be helpful. It's not necessarily fortune telling or future reading, but it's going to give them some sort of nugget of information that is going to help them in the story. And we specifically never call out where that information comes from. Again, that's me not really wanting to delineate between science and magic or spirituality and magic. I like the idea that a player can just go, I'm going to go meditate for a little bit, and I'm going to come back with something cool. Same with Mother's Voice. Mother's Voice is actually caused me a little bit of consternation with some of my players because it says relinquish control to a greater power, which I don't really like that description. Again, the player sort of goes into like a trance mode, and the description the example I think we gave in the book was they want to investigate a room. They're investigating. It's a skill, so they're going to go into this room and investigate for clues, and they're not coming up with anything. So they decide to use this power. Well, they go into sort of a trance, and suddenly they just walk out of the room and walk into a field. All the other players are like, why is he leaving? I thought he was looking for clues. But then he finds something out in the field. How could he have possibly known to go out there? How could they have possibly known that there would be a clue in the field? We don't answer that. And again, that's up to players and their world building to decide whether or not you want to assign an actual literal scientific explanation to that ability, or whether it's spirituality, whether it's religion, whatever you feel is the right way to address that. And even in World, we discussed that a little bit, the fact that, like, for example, there's a power under intelligence called Wasp Sting. It's basically you're attacking somebody psychically. And, of course, then the question becomes is, if I can directly affect someone else with my mind, what does that say about physics or science? How is that physically possible? And what do scientists have to say about that in this world? So there's a good story angle there, too. Walk the Black is sort of like astral travel. So yeah, there's expanded explanations in the book for these, but hopefully one of these abilities calls out to you and speaks to what you've built so far with your character. Anybody have any questions? Yeah, oh yeah.
And the abilities we could choose were based on what part of the other
thing? Sorry, so yeah, so back on the path, so on the very first page of the character creation where it says paths, based on the path you chose, there should be 2 related stats. And so then you can choose any of the abilities that are listed under those stats.
Got it, yeah, because I was looking for, like, abilities that said something Fox, and, like, that wasn't an option.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Was there, I thought I saw another hand go up too. Was there another hand? No? Yeah.
We can pick one of each, right? From, like, you can pick a charisma ability.
No, you pick one ability. You pick one ability. So in the game I say that I'm trying to remember now. Basically, it's a very small percentage of people. Everyone in this world goes through the Audinati process, so everybody gets a stat bonus. All people. Very few people get an ability. All player characters get an ability, but overall, population-wise, very few people get an ability. You can get a second ability as part of a long-term goal. So we have an advancement system in the game that's not based on like experience points in D&D where you're just ratcheting up a number that you eventually roll over like an odometer. It's not like that. Instead, you and your group set goals. Some goals are personal and other goals are determined by the story guide. And when you go up, when you finish those goals, you basically get to you have something you're choosing. So maybe you want to get rid of one of your burdens, or maybe you want to get rid of, or you want a new ability. Those are long-term goals. If you're just trying to up a skill, that's a short-term goal. So there's rules on governing sort of how long each of those take. But that's a little beyond the character creation scope. More questions?
Would you explain Hawk's Eye and Raven's Call?
Yeah, absolutely. So for, let me see here. Let me find it. Let's see what it says. Yeah, so Hawk's Eye is a fun one. So Hawk's Eye is the idea that in the game, you're going to roll a certain number of dice. I can't remember which stat it's based on currently. Might be perception. You roll a certain number of dice, and based on the number of successes you get, you're going to be able to jump up any one of your 5 senses you choose. And sometimes it's multiple, depending on how well you rolled. You might be able to bump 2 or 3 senses up to superhuman levels. At that point, it's sort of up to the story guide, because they're going to decide what information you'd gather that you wouldn't have been able to otherwise. If you can hear beyond a normal hearing range, things like that. What was the other one besides Hawkeye? Oh, Raven's Call. Yeah. Yeah. Again, that's straight up telepathy. So you can communicate mind to mind with other people. In that case, it's sort of limited based on who's receptive to the call. So you can't just start communicating with random strangers. That would be a little invasive. So the person has to be receptive to it. So. But you can also, with that ability, you can also create like a chain link. And we've had players create like a chain link where like their entire group can speak to each other mentally. But it's pretty limited by range also. Anybody else? Oh, yeah.
Is this working? Okay. Yeah. I had a question about how do you calculate mind, body, and soul?
Sure. It's a little beyond what we're doing here, but that's all right. Body is going to be the sum of strength, agility, and endurance. Mind is the sum of intelligence, perception, and wisdom. And if you hadn't guessed, soul is the sum of spirit, charisma, and will. The next 3, body, mind, and the PDs rather, PD, MD, and SD, which stands for physical defense, mental defense, and spiritual defense. Those are the sum of the last 2 of each stats. So for PD, it's the sum of agility and endurance, and so forth. Wow, we got through this one much faster than I did my last one. I don't know what happened here, Matt, but we got through this one a lot faster. Last one took me like an hour and 20 minutes. You know what I mean? Yeah. Does anybody have any more questions right now? I mean, because that's really kind of the limit of what I wanted to go through on this one. I mean, we can talk more about short-term and long-term goals if you want, which is about advancement for your character, because we've got a few minutes. Okay, so again, rather than like a number-valued experience system for how much treasure you accumulate or what things you kill, we decided on this system called the Legendary system, with the idea being that your characters are supposed to be epic heroes that have their tales told down the line. So eight generations down, people are going to be telling stories about your character. So the idea being, with short-term goals are usually about either getting rid of a burden or increasing a skill. And let's say you want to increase a skill from rank 1 to rank 3, or rank 2 rather. You can only go up one at a time. Going to 2 from rank 1 would take you 2 sessions. So you would just say, under short-term goals, you write down archery. And then every time you play, you tack off. And when you hit 2, you're like, I've practiced enough of my archery. I go up. We keep it nice and simple. So your stats are going to go up that way. Long-term goals are decided by you, but they're also a little larger. That's going to be about either changing your gifts and burdens, or they're going to be about adding new abilities, major shifts for your character. Increasing stat points is also a long-term goal. Those usually take about 8 sessions. 8 sessions is the sort of benchmark we use, but then we tell the story guides to sort of adjust based on what they're doing. For example, let's say you had a level 3 burden of issues with your father. Your father is your mortal enemy. Level 3 burden is huge. It might take 8 sessions just to drop that from level 3 to level 2 burden, and that's if the story is resolving around, or is rather revolving around your father. Maybe you haven't even seen or talked to your father, in which case the story guide might say those 8 sessions did not do anything for resolving your burden situation at all. There's also a group goal, and that's sort of private to the story guide, and they're going to decide based on a story arc for what's going on when that group goal is going to be resolved. When that group goal is resolved, you're all going to go up in a legendary rank, and there's a little spot there for legendary rank right next to your stats. And when you go up in a legendary rank, you'd put a 1 there, and that's going to allow you to manipulate the dice by 1 value every single time you roll from then on. And once you get to legendary level rank 2, you'd be able to manipulate the dice by 2 every single time you roll. So it gives you that sort of bonus power along the way. But more importantly, and I think this is one of the funnest parts of the game, is that when you go up in a legendary rank, everybody will go up at the same time at the table. You all go home for the night. You're all expected to sort of recap what you did to become that legendary rank 1. So you're going to recap in whatever format you like. You could write song lyrics, a poem, a short story, whatever you want, and explain why you, as the center of this story, were the hero. And then you all get back around the table together and share all of your individual stories, your poems, your song lyrics, whatever they are, and hopefully you keep a journal of this over time, so you get to see how your character evolves and how you tell these more incredible and dramatic stories as you go along. You're encouraged to completely inflate and blow up the story so that you are way more powerful and awesome than your character actually was, because these are supposed to be about epic tales told around a fire. So that's the short version of the legendary system there.
Connor, we talk a little bit about the name generator and the app.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So Matt was asking about the name generator. So we have an app. There's a Coyote Crow app. It has a few things on it. One, it has a summary of our current news that's going on with the game. It has access to our wiki, which is has a bunch of terms and phrase and explanations, both for the Chahi language, but also within the game. It also has a free dice rolling app, so if you don't have half a dozen or a dozen 12-sided dice, you can use the phone app. And then finally, it has a name generator, and the name generator is built out so that it uses the Chahi syllabary to create a fictional name. I think one of the things that people struggle with sometimes is trying to come up with a fictional name for their characters, and they don't want to give themselves something like Feather Iron Horse, you know. So I think using the name generator will give you a good foundation. Even just scrolling through and hitting generate over and over again is going to allow you to see some of the types of names you can come up with, and then combining that with both the Chahi syllabary that we have on the wiki as well as in the back of the book, you can start coming up with your own names. And I think it's a good way to come up with a cool character name. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that.
I was just feeling stressed out about naming my character.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Yes, yes. Thank you for mentioning that. I mean, if you really don't feel like you're connecting, feel free to just, I always tell people, name it after something that you like is not going to sound like a cliche. Like River. River's a great name. It's a beautiful, lovely name that we can all agree is awesome.
We have 2 or 3 minutes left in our time. So people do have other questions about the characters, or about the world, or about
any specific abilities. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
In the story, what would be the best way to put that? Would it be accomplishing something related to that ability? For example,
yeah, I mean,
let's say you're playing a character that's a little bit more malicious, power hungry, and they're specifically trying to get Coyote's gaze as an ability. Would it be doing something related to manipulating people?
I'd say it's probably more along the lines of you're going to try to go find somebody who has Coyote's gaze and try to learn from them how to activate it. And how those new abilities activate, I have left very vague intentionally because I want that to be part of the story. Gaining a new ability should be big, and it should not just be, oh, you write it down and you get it. It should be a moment in the game. You should build out that to be something really exciting and cool when it happens, because it doesn't happen very often. So, anyone else? Cool. Oh, yeah.
Is there any way for to do surnames or anything like that?
So, okay, so this is going to be sort of a broad answer. When it comes to indigenous folks in general in America, there's a broad array of the way people name each other, how they name each other, when they get their names, whether or not they're self-named or named by others, named by family members or friends. I have a character who has 4 names right now, and 3 of them were accumulated over the course of his life. So given to him by friends, given to him by fellow warriors. So there's a lot of ways you can do that. I don't think there's, as long as you're coming to it in a respectful way, I think you can do however you'd like.
Let's thank Connor for coming today.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. It's a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, everybody, for being here today. We really appreciate it. If you would like to be notified about future World Building Initiative events, I have just learned, a thing we've been meaning to do for a while is now ready. On the Lincoln Center's website, where the World Building Initiative is, there is a sign up for our mailing list, and we will tell you about things we're doing in the future. Our next workshop is going to be in November, and is going to be presenters are going to be Em McDonough, who's here today, and our friend Leah Newsom, and they're going to talk about thought experiments and speculative design and science fiction and fantasy. It's going to be really fun. Em, do you remember what the date is? That's what I think it is too. It's probably November 8th. So November 8th, we'll have that. But if you sign up for the mailing list, we will let you know about it. Please say hi to Connor. Thank you for his time. And we will see you all next time. Thank you so much.